All right. So
and by all means, if you want questions or anything, I'll keep an eye on the chat.
Yeah.
But if you want to ask questions, I suggest you put them in there unless we need some quick clarification.
Yeah.
And you'll get a chance to ask questions afterwards, right?
Yeah. And I'll be pausing as I go to ask questions because it can get a little intense. So
I get it. All right.
All right. Rick, so I'm going to stop my video and share my screen.
All right. Have you already given somebody else some
I can make you host.
I was going to say just co-host in case anybody else comes in and I need to help out.
I don't have a co-host option. It just says host. Make host.
No co-host? Oh.
No, might be on the maybe it's on the because I only have the pro and not the corporate.
Oh, so do I. So, yeah. Okay. Then we'll just have to grin and bear it then.
I have the admission thing right on the
perfect. Then I'll leave it to you then. Okay.
Yeah.
Over to you, Rick.
Okay. So here we go. Share screen. Share this one. Okay. What I did is, for the purpose of this talk, I built a sample site. You know, kind of very basic header, some calls to action, some nice pictures, and you know your basic WordPress site for like a company like you would have. So I made two copies of it. One where I left it alone and just did kind of what an average user would do, and then a second one with how I would build it and my speed tweaks. So as a baseline, this is what's scoring on GTmetrix for the non-optimized site. So in the past I haven't liked GTmetrix, but I'm starting to come around on it only because it's giving you the web vitals, and these are the parts that Google is starting to track. So these are the stats that they're going to start looking at in May when they're ranking your site. I don't know if Natasha wants to jump in on anything there, or I just saw Paul join if he wants to jump in any more on the SEO part of the speed. But these are the core metrics that Google will be looking at. And if you're unfamiliar with GTmetrix, it's at gtmetrix.com. And what you can do is put in your site. And it'll run a speed test for you. This is a non-mobile. And in my comparison, I've been using the mobile only because I assume that's what Google will be.
Because excitement is actually an anticipation, a projection into the future. And so when we're excited, we think it might be love or whatever, but it's actually
someone is
present. When we're actually present with somebody, that's when we can actually share love with somebody and make them love.
It's David. I can't mute him because I'm not the host.
Yeah, I'm muting him.
We're in our body, we're in our senses.
There we go.
Thank you.
So it'll give you a speed grade. It's pretty useful. Let me go back to this one because that's the one we're looking at. It'll give you your performance score and give you some tips on how to improve it. Here's your tips. It'll give you your waterfall, a video of it loading. It's pretty useful. Now, the first thing I always say is that one of the best ways to speed up your site is get your server closer to your end user. As an example, this is the slow site loaded from Dallas, Texas, using another speed test tool. And it loads at 4.9 seconds. And from Toronto, it loads in 3.2. And that's just a matter of changing hosts. This site is hosted on AWS Canadian Central, which I think the data center is in Quebec, if I'm not mistaken. It's Montreal or Quebec City for the data center for that one. So having that closer connection is going to help you, especially if you're a local site. Like if you've got like a local shop or another like a Canadian company selling to Canadians, try to host it in Canada, and that will give you a big speed increase. Like that's almost a full second from just choosing a Canadian location for hosting. So that's kind of the kind of infrastructure change you can make to help your site speed up, and also better hosting. If you're not on shared hosting, will speed you up. Things like that are also very useful. Now, another thing that I tend to do when I build a site is I right size my images. So this image here is I think 1800 pixels wide, and it's not very optimized. On this one, it looks the same. I increased the compression, the JPEG compression in Photoshop a bit. I made it a little smaller because realistically, 1600 pixels wide is probably a sweet spot. And I think the difference, this header image is 245 kilobytes, and this one is 100. So you're saving weight and without losing any visual fidelity. And same thing with this image, just sizing it right, adding some compression, you can save a lot of weight. So your page is smaller and faster. Yeah. So the next thing we can kind of do is now we really start looking at plugins, and this is where it gets confusing for most people. First thing I do is I tend to install an image optimization plugin, just because I know a lot of people don't have access to Photoshop or other tools that do image optimization on their desktop. So one way you can kind of get around that is you can install a plugin like Smush It, which will optimize your images on your website, as opposed to having to do it before you upload. Just there's Smush dashboard. And you can see I've saved 15% on my images just by installing it. And depending on how unoptimized your images are, you can save more. If I go to the Pro, which also saves, which optimizes the full size images, I would save up to 34%. Once again, smaller site gives you a faster download time. And actually, so the next part I like to, once images are kind of sized, like I said, once again, for settings on this, use automatic compression, strip the metadata. I don't use the resize full images only because I'm assuming that you're going to set at least some right-sized images. They also have a lazy load feature, which what it will do is if the image is not on screen, it won't load it. So this is also really useful because what happens is Google loads the first part of the page, say this part, the rest of the images aren't seen, so why bother loading them? And you'll see that, let me just open this site in a new tab. As I scroll down, they're preloaded, so they're already cached. But sometimes you'll see a little like brief second where they fade in. And that's just the lazy load, keeping them from loading on the first page load. And you can apply it to various media, including iframes, which is useful if you're embedding content from another site. That's going to also really slow you down. Another plugin then that I tend to use is caching. So this, I tend to like using WP Supercache than other ones. There's a lot of them out. There's WP Supercache. There's WordPress Total Cache is another big one. WP Rocket has caching. Hummingbird has, which is made by the same guys who make this plugin, Smush It. They also have a caching plugin, but there's a reason I tend to use WP Supercache, and I'll just go through it right now. It's a little more advanced, but I'll show you here. So I always switch it to expert stable caching for logged in users, because you don't want to be, when you're making changes to the site, you don't want to see the cached version. And I probably should take a step back and explain what caching does. Caching, what it does is on the first load of the web page, it will save a static version. So instead of making a bunch of database calls like WordPress normally would, and then make the HTML and then serve it to the person, WP Supercache will make the HTML once and then serve the HTML to all subsequent visitors. So you're skipping the database calls, which will reduce your time to first byte. I'll show you that right now. So there's a waterfall. If you look at this one, this is the uncached one. This is the time from when the web browser says, hey, can I see this page? To the time it gets that page. It's a full 1.5 seconds before it gets any data at all. This one, it's 645 milliseconds, so it's half the time. And that's just turning on caching. So some of the other options I use in here is, as we go to, where is it? Content. Where did it go? I was looking at it earlier today and making the changes. Oh, it's below here. One thing I like on this version is it has a cache timeout. So what the cache timeout is how long between it generating HTML saying, oh, this is now stale, let me generate a new one. I find a lot of the other plugins and even WP Supercache by default is too short. Like by default, WP Supercache is 6,400 seconds, which realistically means that if you don't have a lot of traffic, every visitor is getting a fresh page as opposed to a cached page. So I tend to turn it up higher, and really it depends on the actual site, how long you want to go. So 64,000 seconds is what? Is 1,000 minutes or 17 hours. And you can put it in, I usually use a tool like, I usually Google days and seconds. And I'll tell you, so that's a full day cache, is that. And I would just dump that value in here. So I mean, yes?
Sorry, I thought you were done. A quick question was WP Supercache versus WP Rocket. Are they basically the same?
WP Rocket is it's a paid one. It does have some options, and it has a few extra features. Like it does some of the stuff that Smush does, and some of the other plugins do. So if you want kind of a one-stop solution, it's worth it. But I think it's $50 a year, which isn't bad. It's not a bad price.
Right.
I tried to keep it down to free plugins for this talk.
This presentation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on WP Optimize?
Once again, it's another one. It's good, but like I said, it doesn't have the cache timeout.
Oh,
So
okay.
it uses a default value, and I like the cache timeout because if I know I'm only updating my site once a week,
Mm-hmm.
I can put in a cache timeout of a week, and I
Right.
know that the majority of my visitors will be getting a cached version of the page.
Mm. Okay.
So yeah, and like, that's the reason I tend to stick with WP Super Cache is because I can customize the timeouts.
Mm-hmm. Emily says that that there is one actually, and that she's using a cache lifespan of 24 hours on WP Optimize.
Oh, okay, good. That one does.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't used to have it, I think, or maybe I'm thinking of a different one that doesn't have it. But yeah, I think that if you're choosing a cache plugin, choose one that has a customizable cache timeout because you can guarantee that your visitors are getting live or cached versions of your page. When you know your own traffic and you know your own content posting, like update times. Like I have sites where I have it set to a month,
Right?
Because I know
Okay.
they never post new stuff, and that
Right.
means I know that everyone coming to that site is getting a cached version.
Right.
Yes.
So apparently there's one in WP Rocket as well. And there's a question that if somebody's making updates every day, what would you set your cache timeout to?
If you're setting it up updates every day, I would tend to do my, depending on traffic also. If you're doing updates every day, but you're only getting 100 visits a day,
Mm-hmm.
I would set your cache timeout to like half a day. But
Okay.
if you're getting 1,000 visits a day and you're doing updates every day, then yeah, you want like hourly cache updates.
Right. And I think this is my own question as well, is one of the things I've been hearing about is AMP. A lot of the news sites that do like updates constantly every day are using things like AMP because of things like caching. Can you describe what that is
So
and why
AMP,
you would use it?
yeah, okay. So AMP is a subset of HTML that Google has created, as it were. It basically it's gives you HTML without all the JavaScript and all the extra bells and whistles to create small, almost text and image only versions of pages. When you view on your phone news items, there's that like block of news items at the top of Google's page. Those are all AMP versions of those regular articles. So if you Google, I don't know what happened today. It's COVID.
And the other Rick is saying that WP Rocket also auto clears the cache for any page that's updated.
Yeah, and WP Super Cache will do the same thing.
Cool. Okay,
COVID page.
I'm done interrupting you. Go on.
Yeah, but so these top stories are AMP versions of the pages, and so if you click them on mobile, you get kind of a simplified version of the site, which is useful if you're doing news stuff. I find you're not getting a lot of benefit if you're just blogging, or it's like a business site, because you're not doing that news thing. It's a lot more for this top stories block than it is for anything else. And you'll get basically, like if I hit the reader view in Safari, this is the reader view. This is essentially the AMP version of the page. So you can see like all the ads disappear, all the other stuff disappears that would be on the regular page. Like you lose a sidebar, you lose all this. It's just the content block. It's useful, but like I said, we have a news site in my company has a news site, and we use it for that, but we don't tend to put it on any client sites.
Yeah, I just know that some people have said, oh, I need to have this on my site. But like you said, unless you're doing that many updates and you're doing that kind of thing, then it may or may not be necessary.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah. So those are kind of the cache settings I tend to use.
Rick, just to finish off on that AMP thing, even that requirement for AMP for some of those specialized search results is going away in May, when this new set of speed measurements comes into place. If a website is fast enough without AMP, it will qualify for those special placements anyway.
Oh, okay.
So it's one more nail in the coffin against the technical challenges and difficulties of adding that extra layer of AMP. So keep focusing on a fast site, and you may not have to implement AMP at all.
There you go. So I'm just going to go back to the waterfall between the two. So you can see the difference once again. Caching cuts in half your response time, because it's serving a static version of the site. Now, this is now we start getting into what these tools tell you to do and what really you need to do. There's some differences. If we look at the summary or the tips, one thing that a lot of times they do is they use a content delivery network. A content delivery network, what it does is it takes copies of your assets and puts them on servers closer to your visitors. So just like when we moved the site closer to the testing location got faster, it does the same sort of thing. So it only becomes important if you're doing like a lot of international traffic. So say you sell stuff to both the US and to the UK and to Canada, and you sell internationally, then a content delivery network is useful to you because it starts serving those assets from servers closer to your visitors. But for your average blog or your like local shop, if you've already moved your site closer to your visitors, you don't need a content delivery network. And I find it causes more headaches than just moving your site does to maintain your CDN with SSL certificates and things like that. It tends to add a level of complication that most average users don't need to deal with. Granted, things like Cloudflare are fairly user-friendly, but you can still run into problems where you're trying to figure out, why isn't my site working anymore? Why is Cloudflare down or whatever? I tend to like move the site closer to your visitors. I tend to like that as a solution better than CDNs, unless you're doing international traffic. Then you have stuff like, I'm going to go back to remove unused JavaScript and remove unused CSS. This starts to get a little tricky only because a lot of that's going to be based on your theme and you're not going to have control over that. However, there's a plugin I like called Asset Cleanup. And what that lets you do is it lets you unload or defer the loading of various bits of JavaScript and CSS on your page. It's a bit of an advanced plugin to use, but it really helps get rid of that extra stuff that you don't need. I'm just going to go into the homepage to show you how it works. So what it ends up doing is it lists all the JavaScript and all the CSS loaded on the page. So this is all the stuff that's loaded on the homepage. And I've already gone through and turned some stuff off. And the trick with this plugin is you have to turn something off, update the page, check the page. Turn something off, save the page, check the page. So I didn't want to go through that whole process on this call, but you basically unload on this page, this common modules min.js, save the page, and then test it. So you go load it in a private browser, say, is anything broken? Does my menu still work? Does the mobile menu still work? Is anything not rendering correctly? And you can go through and you can turn off a lot of stuff in your theme and in your other files, like in your plugins. Like say you're not using your slider plugin on a page, you can disable that slider plugin on that page because it'll group it by plugin. So I'm just going to contract objects. So it tells me what plugin things coming from. So this is, all the ones from Elementor. There's a lot. All the ones from Elementor Pro, all the ones from WordFence Security, all the ones from Smush It. Like you see, it loads a lazy load JavaScript. So I don't want to not load that because it'll stop my lazy loading. But it's really handy for turning stuff off if you're willing to put the time in to play with it and have the wherewithal to do all the testing you need to. Because there was one I turned off and I'm like, oh yeah, it works fine. I looked at my mobile and my mobile menu didn't work anymore. So you need to be really, really on top of your testing when you use this plugin. But this is the waterfall, and you can see the JavaScript loaded on this one versus the JavaScript. So there's a lot less. I almost have the amount of JavaScript loaded. And CSS, not as much. There's a couple of CSS files that WordPress adds in, like emoji one that often should be deleted because if you're not using emoji, you don't need the emoji CSS. And you can see you can save a lot of space. This is not as much CSS. If we go to JavaScript, you'll see it'll also tell you how much JavaScript is loaded. So here I have 507K. Here's 834K. So that's 300K of JavaScript that didn't need to be loaded, but I was able to remove. And also those JavaScript files tend to increase your blocking time and your largest content paintful. You can see this one is 2.7 versus 1.5 seconds on the largest content paintful. And I can show you a comparison between the two. That's the one I like. There's another plugin I also tend to use. It's not working on this site for some reason, but it's really useful. There's a plugin called, where's my plugins? OMGF, which what it does is it loads your Google fonts off your own server. So it copies them down. Because what happens is any call to your web server, it says, oh, I need you to get this from another server. So it has to do a whole other handshake and a whole other connection to another server, which takes time. So if you load the Google fonts off your own server, it's not adding that extra round trip of contacting Google. And they also have a version for loading Google Analytics off your own server. So it just downloads a JavaScript and loads that locally as well. I can show you what it looks like when it does run. I couldn't figure out why I wasn't working on this site, but I have it running on a different site. And these are the fonts that it found being called. And I can just say, oh, well, I don't want you to load this at all. Don't load this, don't load this, don't load this. preload these two, and then these are just left to load normally. And that can really save a lot of time in terms of extra round trips in calls. And you'll see that fonts. You'll see that this gray bar is the round trip time for before it starts getting data, and the purple is the actual data. So you'll see that, you know, if that was loading off the same site, it would be short like that bar. So you wouldn't have 1.5 seconds of round trip time. You'd have 0 milliseconds or 56 milliseconds of blocking time. So now, for those of you who want to get into it, I can give you a little bit more background on how to read these waterfalls. Oh, actually, before that, the reason you need to be able to read a waterfall, or at least it helps you read a waterfall, is another one of the performance improvements it tells you to do. Is a lot of times they'll say to combine your JavaScript and your CSS files into one file. And that was true back maybe 2-3 years ago. Since then, servers have kind of updated their technology. They use HTTP2, which what it does, it makes requests in parallel. So you'll see here, all these requests happen at the same time. On older servers, what would happen is it would load this file, then it would load this file, then it would load this file, and then load this file, as opposed to loading them all at once. And you would want to combine your files into one because it would be one call. But with the way servers work these days, with being able to load multiple files at once, it's actually slower to load 100K file than it is to load 10K files. 10K files will load faster because they're all loading, it's only 10K loading all at once, if that makes sense to anyone. It's a bit of an odd concept to grok, I know that. But on an older server, you would see these kind of like this, where these are staggered. You see that for every file, it would be staggered. And it would make your load time much longer. But modern servers, you don't have to worry about that tip. And so after all that, those are kind of the main ones I tend to use. Asset cleanup, chaos, which is load local versions of Google Analytics. I use OMGF, which loads local versions of Google Fonts. I use Smush for my images, and I use WP Supercache or a similar one that lets you set timeouts to load my caching. Does anyone have any questions?
So there were a couple in the chat there. I think we've covered a couple of them, but I'll go back through them here. So one question from Rajesh was, what is the ideal page load time that someone should attain? I was guessing about 3 seconds at most.
3 seconds is good, but realistically faster than your competition.
Good point. Good point.
And as you can see, even my slow site was total page time was
2.7,
three largest content paintful. That is the largest time that it waits to redraw something, a big section of your page. Mm-hmm. But you can see it's 3.3 seconds is my total page load time, mm-hmm. even with my slow quote unquote version.
Right. And that's sort of what we were talking about with, he was saying, okay, then the actual file size or the web page size then should only be about 1.5 megs. And I said, well, not necessarily, as long as your first full paint, it starts to do those things. Yeah. Then the rest can come a little bit later, but I think it's the first full
Yeah, and
meaningful
there
paint that contentful paint that's probably an important thing, right?
and there's things you can do like critical CSS, which what you would do is run it through a critical CSS tool.
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is it uses a fake browser to load your page and figure out what CSS is actually above the fold
Mm-hmm.
when the page loads, and then you would basically dump that CSS in line at the top of your HTML, so that would be an inline. It wouldn't need to wait for CSS to load to show you the top of it, but it's a bit more of an advanced technique, so I didn't want to cover it off on this one.
Okay. Emily was asking if was the Google Analytics option also in OMGF, or was that a separate plugin?
It's a separate plugin. It's from the same developer though.
Same developer though. Okay.
It's called Chaos, CAOS.
Emily, did you want to ask something further?
Oh,
no, she's good. Okay.
Can I stick my 2 cents worth in there?
Yeah.
No, Paul, you can't. No, I'm just kidding. Go ahead, Paul. Please.
The recommendation to load analytics from your own server is often counterproductive. The tools recommend putting those things on your server for, sort of generic reasons. But the reality is that the reason the speed testing tools tell you to do that is because the cache time on Google Analytics file is only 2 hours long. And the standard that these tools all use is it needs to be 30 days if it's going to be considered long enough. Okay, but the trick to remember is Google Analytics is on something like 70% of the websites on the internet, which means if your visitor has been to any other website that uses Google Analytics in the 2 hours before they come to your website, they're not even having to download it. It's being loaded. It's being loaded right from the user's computer. So if you then turn around and load that from your server, it breaks that chain. It means that every visitor coming to your website is going to have to download it fresh.
Yeah.
The reality is most of the time it's already sitting, from the website they were on before yours, it's already sitting on your hard drive ready to be loaded. So you can actually make your page a little bit slower by loading analytics directly from your server rather than from Google's own CDN. The hard part is the measurement tools can't measure that, right? Because they treat each visit as if it's the first time somebody's ever been on the internet. They don't have any carryover from one visit to the next, which is good. It gives us a much cleaner test, but it means that it can't take into account some of these idiosyncrasies like what happens with Google Analytics.
Right.
Yeah, and I find the same with certain fonts. If like Lato, which is probably safe to load, it's probably cached.
Yeah, that's one that unfortunately has just changed. The standards have changed on it, so you can no longer a browser can no longer cross-load fonts. So if that font was loaded to a different site and then it tries to load from your site, it's not allowed to make use of the previous version of itself. It must download it again. That's only changed in about the last 2 months.
So it'll give you a CORS error if you try, I guess.
Yeah, so that's the one interesting thing is because Google always said, oh, you don't use the common Google fonts and load it from load it from Google's CDN. Now they're saying actually, go ahead and figure out the ones you need and load them down to your server and serve them right from your own server. So they've done a complete 180-degree flip flop on the best recommendations for that.
Yeah, and I would always do that with stuff like Adobe fonts or fonts.com fonts. I would also do the same thing, as loaded as a package instead of using their CDN.
That's good to know. A couple of people were saying that bunny.net is pretty good, getting good reviews, and somebody said it was very easy to use. Is there a reason why Lighthouse is giving a better ranking than GTmetrix, to Peter's point?
Lighthouse is what I assume Google will be using. But like I said, this uses Lighthouse when it does its test. So that's why I've kind of started using it a bit more. I used to hate GTmetrix because it would give you all these tips that were no longer relevant. But I started using it again because it uses Lighthouse to pull these core vitals. So it should, like if I retest this, you can see adding to queue. And then basically the third step is running Google Lighthouse.
While that's finishing up, Emily's asking, are you going to talk about cumulative layout shift?
So,
or is that going to be a whole separate talk?
Cumulative layout shift is basically how much your layout changes after all the render blocking resources are in. As you can see, I kind of picked a font that kind of had the same metrics as the default fonts, other than it's thin. You can, if you compare these two pictures, there's not a lot of difference in how many lines of text is different or anything like that. So that kind of comes down to knowing your fonts and things like that, because cumulative layout shift is like, once your font is loaded, all your text is going to reflow. There's a couple of tools out there that help you define CSS for various Google fonts. So you can say, okay, this is the Google font I want to use. What font settings should I be using so there's not a large cumulative layout shift? But I kind of just pick font that I knew were similar, because Montserrat is very similar in metrics to Arial. But so that's why you can see the cumulative layout shift is such a small number. But once again, it's going to come down to your theme and understanding kind of what fonts have what metrics.
One of the really big kickers for layout shift is if you've got images in your viewport that don't specify their dimensions in the HTML.
Yeah.
The way the browser works is when it tries to show the page, it knows there's supposed to be an image there. It'll reserve exactly the right size of space so the page doesn't wiggle around if it knows what the dimensions of the image are going to be. So that's another really common thing that will trigger a slow score on the cumulative layout shift.
But WordPress is pretty good about including sizes now, because if you're using the WordPress, like the 300 by 300 size or whatever the optional sizes are for an image, and it doesn't apply with background images because they don't shift the layout, it's only the text.
Sliders are notorious for killing cumulative layout shift too.
And as you can see, I didn't put a slider on this site. I've refused for the last 4 or 5 years to do sliders on any client sites, because clients tend to, like, first there's a big layout shift, and then clients tend to put like 5 items in, and each one with, you know, a meg of images. And so you end up having a page that's 10 megs because they didn't optimize their images before uploading them and they didn't right size them. So as a rule, I have not built a slider site in like 4 or 5 years.
So a couple of questions, and if Paul or Natasha want to jump in, by all means. Since we're talking about Google, any thoughts about using the Google Site Kit plugin? Does it help any? And someone suggested that you could also use Google PageSpeed Insights if your site is live. But any thoughts on, I mean, I know that I use the Google Site Kit plugin because it's pretty easy to deal with, but any other thoughts on that as far as, we could do an entire talk on that, but insofar as speed goes?
PageSpeed Insights I use on live sites to find the slow pages. Okay. Like I said, I tend to now, especially with the way Google is running, I tend to design with speed in mind. I have been for a while now. So like I said, I'm like, when I have a header image, I'm like, okay, a header image can't be more than 100K. And when I make the image, I make sure that I do what I need to do to get it down to that size. And I kind of have a performance budget in my mind of how big the page should be. So, and I tend to keep that in mind, like, okay, well, I want keep my page under 1.5 megs or something, and I will design with that in mind. There's a great site called Will It Fit on a Floppy, and it'll tell you if your site will fit on a floppy disk.
That's great.
For all the older people.
Yes, yes, I'm going to look that up.
Yeah.
So let me just cover something, because I know that there's been a couple of questions about, I'm doing this and it might be slow, or this and I still can't get it to green. I mean, let's be serious. There are so many things that can affect the speed of your site, right? So for those who may not be as sort of far ahead, and by all means, anyone else can jump in on these. But for those who may not necessarily be as far ahead in what we're talking about, a couple of things right off the bat that WordPress in and of itself, or related directly to WordPress, first things you need to check, your hosting. First and foremost, it doesn't matter how light your site is. If your hosting is not great, then that is going to affect it no matter what you build, right? So that's number one. Number two is that you're also going to want to look at your theme. I've seen a number of themes where they are just absolutely hogs on everything. As a matter of fact, that's what most of my clients come to me for, because they are getting ditched in Google. And when I do an audit on them and I switch to one of the themes out of the repository, it speeds up like a light. It just goes absolutely amazing. So you want to look at where you're getting your theme from and test those types of themes. And I think you touched also upon where you're going to load your fonts from, and then we get into like the JavaScript and the CSS and where all those other pieces are coming from. But I mean, and then of course, the third thing I would look at, of course, as you've already mentioned, are your images, right? Resize them before you upload them, and then, use something that will help to also make them sort of compressed. Somebody suggests, ask like, because we were talking about sliders. So if images are optimized, is it okay to use a plugin slider like Rev Slider, or is it still too heavy? That's the question.
It is fairly heavy to begin with, but it's one of those things, like sometimes that is a required feature. So you have to then save that space somewhere else. Mm-hmm. If you need a slider and you're going to have this amount of weight added to the page, you then need to say, okay, well, I need to use smaller images later, or instead of icons that are PNGs, use icons that are SVGs because they'll be smaller, or even inline them. You make those calls, you're saying, okay, well, where can I save that space? And then you have to make sure you use a tool like Asset Cleanup to make sure that slider JavaScript isn't loading on every page. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And just a quick answer to David's question. Yes, this is going to be posted after the talk, but it's going to take us a while to process all of this. But I posted earlier in the chat WP HamOnt, which is where it will get posted with the write-up and everything else. Are there any other questions? Yeah. Are there any other questions from anybody, or anything else that people want
just to follow up on the SiteKit thing? SiteKit doesn't have anything that directly contributes to improving your page speed. It's just a more easy way of adding things like tracking code and connecting code to the header of the page. So in absolute terms, no, it actually slows down the website, because what it's doing is enabling you to add more code into the header of the site. But it's essential code, so it's a solid, effective, reliable, convenient way to get that code in place. But it doesn't improve speed, and in and of itself, it doesn't harm speed. It's just enabling you to put things in there that the things you put in there might slow things down a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and things like you're going to have your Google tracking code, you're going to have your Facebook tracking pixel, you're going to have possibly some sort of conversion rate optimization, so like a Hotjar or a Fresh Marketer on there. Like all this stuff is going to add to your page weight, and you need to plan for it if you're designing from scratch. Okay, well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh,
I was just going to say, I really like Rick's point is if your design absolutely can't do without a really heavy component, it means you're going to have to put all the extra effort in to find other places to shave back in order to make up for the fact that you've got a big heavy component that you can't avoid. I'm with Rick. I haven't allowed a slider on a site that I've been responsible for in about 3 years. But if there's literally no other way to accomplish what you need to accomplish other than putting in a slider, then you're going to have to be really aggressive, like Rick is showing us with some of the other things that will counteract or save load time in other places to make up for that slow component that you can't get rid of.
But yeah, as you can see, like this is my unoptimized site, and it's still under a meg and a half. I tried to make it big. Right, I put big images in, and I used a very low weight theme though, so that's really contributes to a lot of that. Like, so like, you know, I started at a good place, and that kept it fairly small.
Sorry. So we were talking a moment ago, or I mentioned a couple of things that could affect your speed right off the bat. Rick, maybe you can cover a little bit better than probably I can explain it. Why would hosting or your choice of hosting affect the speed of your site? Does that cover that, Emily? What you were asking earlier? Basically, how does hosting affect your speed?
So hosting, there's a number of reasons.
Hang on, Rick. Sorry, Emily, is that kind of what you were asking?
No, actually, my question was relating back to the cumulative layout shift. It wasn't about hosting at all. Okay. So sorry for the confusion.
Okay, very well. Then we'll leave that one. Is that okay? Did you get your answer? You did. Okay, cool. So just going through here, question, in terms of lazy loading content, can some accordions or other tools work?
I don't think so. This is one of those weird things where certain browsers will load hidden content and certain ones won't. So I tend to assume that if the HTML is there, the content's going to load. It's never been clear to me on hidden content, because I know hidden content's an issue for accessibility anyway. So it gets loaded, like even images, the alt tags get loaded on with an accessible browser. So and when you look at waterfalls on a page with an accordion, it still loads the images most of the time that I see on any of the tools.
Are there any? Sorry, I was going to say, are there any other questions? Sorry, Rick, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so my answer would be that the accordion wouldn't prevent it from loading, and it might actually interfere with lazy loading. Is the other thing. If you have the lazy loading plugin, it might actually interfere with it.
Okay, are there any other questions for anybody? Great. Thanks, Rick. We really appreciate this. This is awesome.
Hopefully I didn't be too crazy for people.
Well, you know what? It's such a big topic that it's hard to say where on the scale do you go, right? Do you go to the fully advanced stuff, or do you go to the basics, and where do you fit in the middle, and what? There's so many things that can affect it that it's really hard to sort of nail down. But I think you've at least given us sort of like, here's what it looks like when you do this. These are the things you got to look out for, and at least some of the considerations anyways, right?
Yeah, and as you can see, like the difference is a B versus a C. It doesn't seem like a lot, but the big gain is a full second in largest content paintful.
Right.
Right.
Right. And the Web Vitals is based on Lighthouse, right?
Yes.
Which is what Google is going to be using, as you said earlier. So if you, I think, answer, Rajesh, to your question about what should we follow, Google page speed or GTmetrix, the answer is probably both.
Yeah, if you use Lighthouse,
it's more heavily towards the Web Vitals, which is Google, or what Google is going to base it on, anyways.
Yeah,
that's probably what you want to go.
Yeah, like I said, I didn't like GTmetrix for a long time, but now they started including the Web Vitals as an easy to read kind of thing. Yes, so I'm like, okay, I'm coming around.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
The other thing to keep in mind, if your site is live and it's getting a moderate amount of traffic, those web vital measurements that Google is aware of and understanding are listed in your Google Search Console reports. That's kind of the Bible as far as Google's concerned. Those are the numbers that they're using. The problem is if you don't have a lot of traffic to your site, they may not have enough information from live visitors to populate that information. But if it is in there, definitely watch for that, because it's going to give you information about every page of your website, not just your homepage.
Okay. Anybody else with questions for Rick on speed? The need for speed.
I mixed my movies there on that.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. I feel the need. Does anybody know how many visitors you need to get for that data to hit? Because I know on a couple of mine, and I think even WP HamOnt hasn't hit enough people. Paul, do you know how many you've got to hit before you get that data?
No, Google's never stated limits. The challenge is that it's per page. So it's not the total amount of traffic to your website. Each page has to be getting sufficient search originating traffic for them to be tracking those numbers. So it's another of the frustrations in the world of those of us who aren't running, massive multi-thousand visitor per page sites. But just watch for it. There will often be a point after a couple of months where it will start to populate. So I strongly suspect as we get closer to May that they're going to start lowering the threshold. The problem that Google has is the same one that we have to watch out for. If only 5 people have been to your page and 3 of them are using incredibly slow connections and are having a bad day, that can completely skew the results for that page, because there's only 5 data points, right? So Google's trying to not be unfair to us by saying, oh, if you've got a page that only has a few visits and somebody has a really bad day visiting your page, you're going to get penalized for a slow page. They're trying to balance out those requirements. So,
and isn't it going to be like at first just a flag on the SERP, or is it actually going to be a ranking factor?
It's actually going to be a ranking factor the same way it is now. Keep in mind, this is not Google coming out of nowhere with a whole new set of considerations. Speed is a very minor ranking factor now and has been for 3.5 years. So even John Mueller in conversations this week, because I've been watching very carefully. He's a direct spokesman for Google, and he's come right out and said, we don't know how big a factor it's going to be, but Google has always said with speed up until this point, it is a minor tiebreaker type of ranking factor rather than a determining primary factor. So Rick made the point, right? Make sure you're faster than your competitor's website. And to a great extent, that's how Google looks at speed up to this point, is simply, are you fast enough to be in reasonable expectations of what your competitors are doing? Then the speed aspect isn't even used as a ranking factor. Everybody's kind of on an even keel and working based on their content and how well they answer the query. So don't expect, it's really easy to get into an arms race on speed optimization, because it's something that's completely under our control, and so much of SEO isn't. But it's not going to be the kind of thing where if you bump up your scores by 3 or 4%, you're going to see a 3 or 4% ranking improvement. It's going to be used as a disqualifier. Here's 10 possible sites that can answer this question, and 3 of them have really big content cumulative layout shifts and slow contentful first paints. They are going to be moved down the rankings compared to the other 7. Or there are 2 that are equally good answers for the question and 1 is substantially faster. But every time Google gets asked about this, they're saying the primary requirement is which page answers the query the best. And even if it's a slow page, if it's obviously the better answer to the question, it will still be the ranking page for it. So this stuff is all going to kick in, and when you're in a competitive vertical, you need all the benefit you can get. But don't freak out that if you've got 1 or 2 of those numbers in the yellow instead of the green, that it somehow means that you're going to lose all your traffic or you're going to lose all your rankings. That's not the way Google's going to work this. For at least the first 2 years of the original speed ranking factor, it applied to less than 10% of search queries. So in 90% of cases, it wasn't even factored in. They haven't been clear about, whether they built it up from there or not, but this is not the be all end all ranking factor that's going to determine the success of your website. So do the right thing for your users first off, getting it under 3 seconds, because that's that look and feel stage, like Rick says, where it feels fast. When you go from 3 to 5 seconds, that's a noticeable speed difference. When you go from 3 seconds to 2 seconds, that's nice, but it's not going to be the make or break whether somebody's happy with the website or not.
Is it Mamdou? You have a question?
Yes, please. Yeah, I'm really interested in speed, and I do a lot of testing on GTmetrix especially. And I've noticed that at times you test your website, you get a specific score, and then without making any changes to the website, at another time you get like a different score, sometimes worse, sometimes better. So is there any explanation for that?
So that's because there's a lot of factors. Like there's latency in the network. There's server load on your site. Like if there's other visitors there. If there's certain server problems in the data center, I always run an average. So I don't run it once, run it like 5 times and take your average and use those numbers as what you're going with. Because that's the thing is like I can run this one test and the next second it'll be 2 seconds for the largest content painful, and I haven't changed anything. So it's always like I make a change, run 5 tests, make a change, run 5 tests on the speed, make a change, run 5 tests. And this is why it takes long to do it, because you can't just do a one-off test because you just might have, hit a magic time in the server.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
So, Rick, do you use Divi a lot? I don't think you do you?
I don't. I use Elementor mostly.
Sorry, you do?
I use Elementor.
Elementor, okay.
And one of the reasons I like it is because I can, especially for background images, I can do multiple background images for different size,
right?
Different size screen sizes. Like if this one, you'll notice that this is actually a different image at the screen size than it is in here. It's on the fast site. Right, you see it sits down at the bottom, and it lets me do things like that. And that's one of the reasons I kind of like it. But who was our Divi person when we did our was it Michelle though? When we did our
might have been, yeah, because I know Matt would have been our Beaver Builder person.
Yeah.
So it might have been Michelle. Emily, I recommend, even if you don't have one here, the WP Slack team has everybody across Canada. So you're bound to find a Divi user in there for sure. We have a help support channel too. And again, that's not just Hamilton's, that's all of the Canadian peeps across the country. So
I've seen Divi questions in there before and they get answered.
Exactly. So. I think there's some pretty heavy duty Divi users in there. I know that Oxygen has been coming up. Thanks, Boris. Has been coming up a lot quite lately, especially against not Divi. Was it Elementor? Let's not go there. It'll be. Trust me, that can take an entire evening. We've already done the page builder wars, but I know that that's sort of like the news in WordPress lately is.
I've been playing with the block.
I know Paul knows more about it because he and I had a conversation about it. So, Paul, I listened. I promise. If you want to follow that up, that's on the Slack team as well. Sorry, go ahead, Rick.
Oh, I've been playing with the block-based ones.
Yeah.
To use the block editor as a page builder. Yeah. And they're pretty good too.
Yeah, because you were saying Cadence, right?
No,
I was what you were using before.
I was playing with something else. I'm trying to remember what I was playing with.
I thought it was Cadence, but anyway.
Yeah, a couple of people have been recommending Cadence as a base for either Elementor or some of the other page builders that are available.
It uses the block builder. Like it doesn't even use a page builder. It uses the Gutenberg block builder as its basis.
Okay, cool.
Harish, you had a question about those annoying mobile usability issue warnings. The trick is actually click through the report and see how many pages they're complaining about. This is often a glitch in Google Search Console reporting, and you'll find that they're only mentioning a problem on 2 or 3 pages, and if you just resubmit the pages for re-indexing, the problem goes away. There's a technical process in the way Google Search Console does its measurements that can sometimes trigger these when there's actually no problem. So the very first thing is determine that it's only a page or 2 that has the problem, and then use Google Search Console to resubmit, pretending that you fixed something, and you'll find that when it re-indexes them, it doesn't have the problem the second day around. If it shows the problem on like 20 or 30 pages or all of your blog post pages, it means you've got a template issue that you need to fix. But like I say, I don't think I honestly don't think I've got like 35 sites in my Google Search Console account, and I don't think I've had a single one of those warnings in the last year that was a legit warning. It completely went away on its own. So don't use up a whole lot of your attention and time investment troubleshooting it. Just resubmit the pages and see if the problem is removed that way.
Sandra has a question. Is Divi known for slowing down sites?
Any page builder is going to slow down the site because it adds extra CSS, extra JavaScript that you're not using. So it's kind of like you're already starting at a bit of a disadvantage when you're using a page builder. And it's kind of the cost of flexibility, and you just have to you have to deal with it. Some are better than others. I haven't done a speed comparison between building the exact same page in 3 different builders yet. And see what I get, but I've done it where I've taken a page and I've rebuilt it using advanced ACF, advanced content fields, and in a custom theme, and it's always fresh on the content on the custom theme because I'm only loading the CSS that I need. I even did a WordPress talk on it. So. Hope that answers your question.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions? Last call.
I've got a quick question. It's open really to anyone.
Go ahead, Harish.
I used to use GT metrics quite a bit, and I used to use WP Optimize on my site. And so obviously if you use WordPress, you have to go in and update your plugins. And so I did that every day. It seemed like I was manually updating plugins. So one day I decided, you know what, I'm putting auto update on because I've done this manually forever, never had any issues at all ever.